47 alien warships ripping through the fabric of space. 2 billion sleeping civilians on the colony.
Hold on! Speed sizing!
Zero chance of
Keep it their
reinforcements
seat!
arriving.
God, what
They
the
say the
heck
void
now?
of deep space is entirely silent, but when the end of the world comes, it arrives with the bone-rattling frequency that you feel in your teeth before you ever see it on a radar screen. Would you run when the odds are 1,000 to 1 and the enemy is a nightmare of jagged metal and merciless intent? Would you turn your ship around and flee into the dark? Most of the galaxy would. Most of the galaxy does. But when the distress call echoes in the dark and innocent lives are trapped in the crosshairs of extinction, humans do not run. We dig in our heels, we lock our shields, and we answer the call. This is the story of the Vega Stand. The Vega system was never meant to be a fortress. It was a frontier. The planet New Washington hung in the blackness like a fragile blue and green jewel, suspended against the cold light of a distant dying star. It was a working-class world. The men and women down there did not wear tailored suits or sit in glass towers. They were miners pulling raw tungsten from the asteroid belts. They were farmers cultivating stubborn soil under artificial atmospheric domes. They were engineers building orbital platforms with calloused hands and a quiet, unyielding pride in their craftsmanship. They were families, they were children sleeping under thin blankets, trusting that the dark sky above them was being watched. They believed they were safe. They believed the United States Space Force was an impenetrable shield. They were about to find out at exactly how much that shield could endure before it shattered. In the high orbit of New Washington, holding a steady, silent vigil, floated the Second Fleet. And at the vanguard of that defensive line sat the USS Vengeance. She was a destroyer. She was not the newest vessel in the Armada, nor was she the sleekest. Her hull bore the micro-abrasions of 100 deep space patrols, the paint stripped back to dull gray armor plating in places where the cosmic dust had acted like sandpaper over the decades. But she was built the old way, built with redundant power grids, ulled titanium bulkheads, and engines that hummed with a deep rhythmic vibration that every sailor aboard knew by heart. She was a working ship for a working crew. On the bridge of the Vengeance, the lighting was kept to a low tactical red. It was the third watch, the graveyard shift. The air smelled of recycled oxygen, hot copper, and the bitter, comforting aroma of black coffee. Captain Alara Vance stood at the center of the command deck. She did not pace. She did not fidget. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her posture straight, staring out through the massive armor-glass viewport into the endless sea of stars. Vance was a woman forged in the quiet discipline of military service. Her dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was pulled back tightly. Her uniform was immaculate, but her eyes carried the heavy, tired weight of a leader who had seen too much of the galaxy's cruelty. She knew every bolt, every wire, and every single soul aboard her ship. She knew that her chief engineer had a newborn daughter waiting in a colony 3 sectors away. She knew her navigation officer played the harmonica when he thought no one was listening. She knew them, and her absolute unwavering duty was to bring them home. "Time to target on the patrol sweep, Ensign," Vance asked. Her voice was steady, resonant, not too loud, but it cut through the hum of the bridge equipment instantly. Ensign Miller, a young man fresh out of the academy, leaned over his glowing green console. 3 minutes until we complete the grid pattern, Captain. Scanners are clear. Local space is quiet. Radiation background is stable. Keep your eyes on the drift, Vance replied, walking slowly toward the tactical map. Quiet is just a word for the time between storms. Her executive officer, Commander Elias Thorne, stepped up beside her. He held out a battered steel travel mug. "Coffee, Captain?" Thorne asked. His voice carried the rough, gravelly tone of a man who had spent too many years breathing recycled air. "Is it from the mess hall synthesizer, or is it the real stuff you smuggle from Earth, Elias?" Vance asked, taking the mug. "I have no idea what you're talking about, ma'am. Smuggling is a court-martial offense." Thorne replied, a faint, dry smile touching the corner of his mouth. Vance took a sip. It was strong enough to peel paint. It was perfect. "Noted. Thank you, Commander." For a moment, there was peace, the kind of quiet, routine peace that sailors crave and dread in equal measure. The bridge crew worked with the quiet competence of professionals who knew their craft. There was no wasted movement, no unnecessary chatter, just the steady work of keeping a warship alive in the vacuum of space. Then the universe tore itself apart. It did not happen with a warning alarm. It did not happen with a blip on the radar. It happened with a drop in temperature that made the breath catch in Vance's throat. The steel coffee mug in her hand began to vibrate. Not a mechanical vibration from the ship's engines, but a deep harmonic resonance that seemed to echo from the atoms of the ship itself. The lights on the bridge flickered. The red tactical glow surged into a blinding white, then dropped to a dim, sickly orange. "Report," Vance snapped. The coffee mug was placed onto the nearest console. Her hands were suddenly free, her stance widening. I don't know," Miller stammered. His fingers flew across his console, panic bleeding into his young voice. "Sensors are getting washed out. Total whiteout on the gravitational scanners. It's like a black hole just opened up inside our defensive perimeter. Recalibrate the tachyon grid. Filter out background radiation," Thorne ordered, stepping over to Miller's station. "Talk to me, Ensign. What are we looking at?" "Gravitational wave incoming," Miller said, his voice rising in pitch. "Massive displacement. Captain, something is pulling itself out of slip space. It's too big. The mass reading is impossible." "Nothing is impossible, Ensign," Vance said, stepping up to the armor-glass viewport. Her eyes narrowed. "Show it to me." The space outside the viewport began to distort. The stars, usually fixed and cold, began to bend and smear in a circular pattern, like light shining through a warped pane of glass. The darkness itself seemed to boil. Then the void ripped open. It was a jagged, violent tear in the fabric of reality, bleeding a sickening purple light into the blackness. And from that wound, the enemy emerged. They did not fly in formation. They poured out like a swarm of locusts. Sleek, heavily armored gunboats, shaped like the barbed heads of spears, shot out of the anomaly, their engines burning with a violent, radioactive green thrust. Behind them came the destroyers, massive asymmetrical slabs of dark metal, bristling with energy cannons. It was the Vora, a species that did not negotiate, a species that did not take prisoners. They were a force of pure genocidal expansion, stripping planets of their resources and leaving only ash and silent graves in their wake. Humanity had clashed with them in small skirmishes on the outer rim, losing good men and women in brutal sudden ambushes. But this was no skirmish. This was an invasion. Multiple contacts. Miller shouted, his training finally overriding his terror. 10, 20, 35, 47 capital-class warships dropping into the sector. They bypassed our outer warning buoys entirely. They're right on top of us. 47 ships, Thorne whispered, staring at the tactical display as it lit up with a swarm of red icons. "Against the Second Fleet. They have us outnumbered 3-1. "Raise shields," Vance ordered. Her voice did not shake. It was a hammer hitting an anvil. "Full power to the kinetic barriers. Bring the main railguns online and spin up the magnetic coils. Seal all bulkheads. Sound general quarters." The ship responded instantly. The klaxons began to wail, a rising, furious scream that echoed down every corridor of the USS Vengeance. Red emergency lights began to strobe. The deck vibrated violently as the massive twin-linked railguns mounted on the ship's spine pivoted forward, locking into firing position. But the enemy was not done. The purple wound in space did not close. It widened. It stretched until it seemed to consume half the sky. And then the Leviathan arrived. It was a supercarrier, a dreadnought of such colossal proportions that it generated its own microgravity field. It was over 20 miles long, a terrifying Gothic cathedral of black iron and green energy. Its surface was crawled with glowing veins of plasma pulsing like the heartbeat of a demon. At its bow, a massive, cavernous opening began to glow with a blinding, catastrophic light. It was a siege weapon, a planet cracker. Vance stared at the Leviathan. She felt a cold, hard knot form in her stomach. She knew with the absolute certainty of a veteran commander exactly what she was looking at. "They aren't here for a naval battle," Vance said quietly. "Captain?" Thorne asked. "Look at their trajectory," Vance said, pointing at the tactical display. "They aren't fanning out to engage our fleet. They are driving a wedge straight down the middle. That flagship, that monster, it's ignoring us." "Where is it heading?" Miller asked frantically, running the projected flight paths. He looked up, the blood draining completely from his face. "Oh God, the planet. Captain, it's locking its main weapon onto New Washington. The targeting lasers are already touching the atmosphere. 2 billion people, 2 billion sleeping souls. In exactly 12 minutes, that weapon would achieve full charge. When it fired, it would not just scorch the surface. It would punch a hole through the planetary crust, hit the molten core, and shatter New Washington into a billion pieces of dead rock. Comms, Vance barked. Get me Fleet Command, now. Channel open, Captain, the communications officer replied. Static hissed over the bridge speakers, followed by the heavy, authoritative voice of Admiral Thaddeus Graves, broadcasting from the fleet flagship. All vessels of the Second Fleet, Admiral Graves' voice echoed. It was a voice that commanded respect, a voice that had ordered men to their deaths before and bore the weight of every single one of those ghosts. You see what is in front of us. They bypassed our border. They brought a hammer to crush our home. The bridge of the Vengeance was completely silent, save for the wailing of the klaxons. Every man and woman was listening. They think because they caught us off guard, we will break, Graves continued, the static crackling behind his words. They think because they are larger, we will yield. They do not know who we are. They do not understand that the United States Space Force does not retreat when civilians are at our backs. Through the viewport, Vance watched the Vora swarm accelerate. The green trails of their engines looked like poisonous scratches across the stars. We are the line in the sand, Graves' voice thundered over the comms. If they want New Washington, they have to go through us. Form a defensive wall around the Leviathan. Target their escort ships. Do whatever it takes to buy time for the civilian evacuation. Hold this line, sailors. Graves out. The channel clicked shut. Vance looked at her crew. She saw the fear in their eyes. It was a natural human thing to be afraid of the dark, and what was coming out of it was the darkest thing any of them had ever seen. But beneath the fear, she saw something else. She saw resolve. She saw the quiet, stubborn pride of people who knew how to do their jobs. You heard the Admiral, Vance said, stepping back to her command chair and gripping the armrests. We have a job to do. Ensign Miller plotted an intercept course. Put us directly between that Leviathan and the planet. Captain, if we move out of formation, we will be exposed to their Vanguard gunboats, Thorne warned softly. Commander Vance said, her eyes locked on the massive enemy dreadnought. If we stay in formation, 2 billion people die in 12 minutes. We are going to draw their fire. We are going to make them look at us. She pressed the intercom button on her chair, opening a shipwide channel. This is the captain, Vance said. Her voice was calm. It did not shake. It carried through the mess halls, the engine rooms, the sleeping quarters, and the gunnery decks. We have hostiles in system. This is not a drill. I will not lie to you. The enemy has us outgunned, and they have us outnumbered. But behind us are 2 billion innocent people who cannot fight for themselves. Down in the engine room, a chief petty officer wiped grease from his forehead and reached for a heavy wrench, his jaw set tight. They are relying on us, Vance continued. They are trusting us to be the shield. We are the USS Vengeance. We do not break. We do not fold. We hit them hard, and we make them pay for every inch of space they try to take. Secure your stations. Brace for combat maneuvers. She released the button. Engines to maximum thrust, Vance ordered. Maximum thrust aye, the helmsman confirmed. The deck plates vibrated violently as the massive fusion drives of the destroyer ignited to full capacity. The USS Vengeance, a battered, aging workhorse of the fleet, surged forward out of the defensive line. She did not wait for the enemy to come to her. She charged. Target the lead Vora destroyer, Vance commanded. Arm the forward torpedo tubes. I want a firing solution in 10 seconds. Solution locked, the weapons officer called out. Fire! With a concussive shudder that rattled the teeth of everyone on the bridge, 2 heavy anti-ship torpedoes launched from the forward tubes. They streaked through the blackness of space, leaving brilliant trails of white fire. The Vora destroyer, arrogant in its advance, tried to raise its kinetic barriers, but it was too slow. The torpedoes struck the enemy ship directly amidships. The explosion was a beautiful, terrifying bloom of orange and yellow against the cold dark. The Vora ship shattered its hull, buckling and splitting apart as secondary explosions ripped through its internal magazines. Debris scattered out into the void. Then silence. The opening shot had been fired. The United States Space Force had drawn first blood. But the victory was momentary. The light of the explosion faded, revealing the terrifying reality of the situation. The swarm of Vora gunships suddenly shifted their trajectory. Like a hive of angry hornets reacting to a thrown stone, they broke off from the main fleet and turned their glowing green engines toward the USS Vengeance. 47 ships against a fleet, and now a dozen heavily armed gunboats bearing down on a single isolated destroyer. "They've noticed us," Thorne observed, gripping the console as the ship banked hard to starboard. "Good," Vance said, her eyes narrow and cold. "Let's see what they've got." Evasive pattern Delta, fire railguns at will. The Vengeance danced through the void. Tracers of plasma fire from the Vora ships whipped past the Armaglass viewport, illuminating the bridge in harsh strobe light flashes of green. The ship shuddered violently as a glancing hit struck the port side shields, sending sparks raining down from the ceiling conduits. "Shields holding at 80%, Miller shouted over the noise. "Keep us moving," Vance ordered. "Don't let them box us in." She fired. The heavy railguns on the ship's spine sent solid slugs of depleted uranium hurtling across the void at a fraction of the speed of light. A beam hit. Another Vora gunboat crumpled inward, its armor folding like crushed paper before it detonated. They were holding their own. They were fighting back. The crew of the Vengeance moved with synchronized perfection, calling out targets, adjusting shield harmonics, and executing evasive maneuvers. It was a symphony of violence conducted by a captain who refused to blink. But on the tactical display, the true horror of the situation was unfolding. While the Vengeance fought for its life, bleeding the enemy vanguard, the Leviathan continued its slow, inexorable march toward New Washington. "Captain," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, tight whisper, "the Leviathan, it's not slowing down." Vance looked at the display. The dreadnought was plowing through the wreckage of the battle, ignoring the fleet's coordinated fire. Its shields were too thick. The combined bombardment of the human warships was splashing against its hull like rain against a brick wall, and the massive weapon at its bow was glowing brighter. "Time to planetary firing range," Vance asked. 8 minutes, Miller replied, swallowing hard. 8 minutes. In 8 minutes, the line would fail. The shield would break. On the bridge of the Vengeance, alarms suddenly began to shriek with a new frantic pitch. "Captain," Miller yelled, staring at his console in disbelief. "The Vora gunboats! They've stopped firing plasma." "What?" Vance stepped forward. "Explain." "They're switching weapon systems. It's an energy spike, high voltage, magnetic distortion." Before Vance could issue a counter order, the dark void outside the viewport was illuminated by a blinding, invisible wave of force. It wasn't a laser. It wasn't a kinetic slug. It was an electromagnetic pulse of unimaginable power, focused entirely on the hull of the USS Vengeance. The wave hit the ship like a physical blow. The kinetic barriers flashed a brilliant, agonizing blue and then shattered like glass. The impact threw Vance to the deck. Thorne crashed into the tactical table. Sparks exploded from every console on the bridge, showering the crew in molten copper. And then the worst sound a sailor in deep space can ever hear echoed through the ship. The low, comforting hum of the main reactor ground to a violent, shuddering halt. The red emergency lights popped one by one. The tactical displays went black. The artificial gravity generators whined, struggling to maintain their hold before failing entirely. The bridge plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. There was no sound. There was no vibration. The USS Vengeance was dead in the water. Vance pushed herself off the deck, floating slightly in the microgravity. She grabbed the edge of the navigation console to anchor herself. Her ears were ringing. The smell of ozone and burning plastic filled the air. "Damage report," she shouted into the dark. "Sound off. Main power is gone." Thorne's voice came from the darkness, strained and tight. "Auxiliary batteries are offline. The EMP fused the primary relays. Weed out the dead circuits. Reroute through the manual backups," Vance ordered, feeling blindly in the dark for an emergency flashlight. "Get the life support online or we'll freeze in 10 minutes. Captain Miller's voice trembled from the other side of the bridge. "I said reroute the power ensign." "Captain, listen." Vance stopped moving. She held her breath. The bridge crew fell dead silent. Without the hum of the engines, the ship was a metal tomb. But it was not entirely quiet. Through the thick titanium bulkheads, through the layers of armor plating, echoing up from the lower cargo bays of the disabled destroyer. They heard it, a heavy metallic thud, then another. Then the unmistakable sound of plasma torches cutting through the exterior airlocks. The screech of tearing metal. The Vora had not fired the EMP to destroy the ship. They had fired it to paralyze her. They were not trying to blow the Vengeance out of the sky. They were boarding her. In the pitch black of the bridge, Captain Alara Vance unholstered her sidearm. The heavy metallic click of the safety disengaged sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. 47 ships, 2 billion lives. And now the monsters were at the door. Thorne, Vance said, her voice dropping to a cold, lethal whisper. Break open the armory lockers. Issue rifles to every man and woman who can stand. Captain, without power, the blast doors won't hold, Thorne said. They don't have to hold, Vance replied. She chambered around. We do. The darkness inside the USS Vengeance was absolute. It was not the quiet, peaceful dark of a sleeping world. It was the heavy, suffocating black of a grave. Gravity had failed the moment the enemy's electromagnetic pulse shattered the main reactor. Inside the command bridge, the crew floated in a dead, frozen sea of silence. Loose data pads, pens, and drops of spilled coffee drifted through the air like slow-moving constellations. The only light came from the faint, sickly green glow of emergency chemical sticks snapped and strapped to the bulkheads. The only sound was the ragged, rapid breathing of men and women who knew they were about to die but refused to go quietly. Captain Alara Vance caught a floating handhold. She pulled herself toward the weapons locker. Her movements were deliberate, steady. Panic was a luxury they could no longer afford. Check your magazines, Vance said. Her voice cut through the dark. Calm, authoritative. If you are firing a kinetic weapon in zero gravity, remember your training. Anchor yourselves. Lock your boots to the deck grates or brace against a bulkhead. The recoil will throw you backward. Beside her, Commander Elias Thorne racked the slide of an assault rifle. The sharp metallic clack sounded like a judge's gavel. We have 30 rounds per magazine. No resupply, Thorne said, tossing a rifle to Ensign Miller. The young man caught it clumsily in the weightless environment, his hands trembling. 30 rounds is enough, Vance replied. Make them count. Deep in the bowels of the ship, the tearing of metal grew louder. It was a vicious industrial screech. The Vora were not picking the locks. They were using plasma cutters to melt straight through the titanium hull. The United States Space Force built their ships to withstand the crushing pressure of deep space and the blistering heat of atmospheric reentry, but they were not built to keep monsters out. They're through the outer hull, Thorne whispered, staring at a portable motion tracker. The small screen cast a pale blue light over his scarred face. Deck 4, port side. They were inside the perimeter. Seal the blast doors on decks 3 through 6, Vance ordered. Manual overrides, force them into the main spinal corridor. We make our stand at the choke points. Below them on deck 4, the reality of the invasion hit like a sledgehammer. Chief Petty Officer Gunny Barnes, a 30-year veteran of the fleet, floated at the end of a long, narrow hallway. He had 6 young sailors with him. None of them were combat marines. They were mechanics, engineers, kids who turned wrenches and calibrated sensors. Now they held cold steel in their hands, their knuckles white. Stay low, Barnes growled, locking the magnetic clamps on his boots to the floor. Wait for the breach. Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes. If they even have eyes. At the far end of the corridor, the heavy steel blast door began to glow. First a dull cherry red, then a blinding magnesium white. The metal bubbled. It hissed. Then the door blew inward. The pressure change was instantaneous. A violent gust of venting atmosphere sucked the loose debris in the hallway toward the breach, before the ship's emergency containment field snapped shut, sealing the vacuum. Through the smoking, melted hole in the door, the Vora stepped onto the USS Vengeance. They were massive, 8 feet of biomechanical terror. Their armor was a dark, jagged carapace that looked grown rather than forged. They carried heavy particle cannons and curved serrated blades that hummed with thermal energy. They did not move like soldiers. They moved like apex predators. Fire! Barnes roared. The corridor erupted in a deafening storm of kinetic fury. The sailors pulled their triggers. Muzzle flashes strobed like lightning in the dark corridor. Depleted uranium rounds tore down the hallway. The bullets hit the lead Vora. The creature's personal energy shield flared a violent purple, absorbing the first few impacts. But human weapons were crude, heavy, and brutally effective. The sheer volume of kinetic force shattered the shield. Rounds bit into alien armor. Black blood, thick as oil, sprayed out into the zero-gravity environment, floating in perfect, grotesque spheres. The lead creature let out a guttural, clicking roar and fell backward. "Keep firing," Barnes yelled. "Pour it on." But the Vora did not retreat. They stepped over their dead. The second alien raised its weapon. A beam of searing green plasma ripped down the hallway. It struck a young mechanic next to Barnes. There was no scream. The heat instantly vaporized the air in the sailor's lungs. He was thrown violently backward, his life extinguished in a fraction of a second. Barnes didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He adjusted his aim and fired a 3-round burst through the visor of the alien's helmet. It dropped. But there were too many. They poured through the breach a relentless tide of dark metal and green light. Then something strange happened. Something that made the blood run cold in Barnes's veins. The Vora reached the middle of the corridor. They had the human defenders pinned down. They could have rushed the barricade. They could have slaughtered Barnes and his remaining men. Instead, the alien stopped. The lead warrior looked at the barricade, then turned its massive head toward the heavy access hatch leading to the ship's central elevator shaft. With a brutal kick, it shattered the hatch. The Vora began to file into the shaft, pulling themselves downward. They were ignoring the crew. "Cease fire," Barnes barked, lowering his smoking rifle. The remaining sailors stopped shooting. The silence crashed back down on them, heavy and ringing. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the fading heat of the melted blast door and the floating, glowing embers of plasma fire. "Chief," one of the sailors whispered, his voice cracking. "Why did they stop? Where are they going?" Barnes stared at the shattered elevator hatch. His mind raced, calculating the ship's schematics. The elevator shaft went straight down. Past the mess hall, past the armory, past the life support scrubbers. It ended in only one place. Barnes reached for his shoulder comms. "Bridge, this is Barnes. Do you read?" Static hissed. Then Vance's voice cut through. "I read you, Chief. Report. Did you hold Deck 4? "Captain, they breached." Barnes said, his voice grim. "We engaged. We took casualties. But, Captain, they broke contact." "Say again, Chief. They retreated." "No, ma'am. They bypassed us. They're moving down the main spinal shaft. They aren't sweeping the ship for the crew. They don't care about us." On the bridge, Captain Vance felt a sudden icy grip tighten around her heart. She pushed off the bulkhead, floating rapidly over to the darkened engineering console. She wiped a layer of soot from the glass and stared at the static blueprints etched into the monitor frame. If an enemy boards a ship, they go for the bridge to take control, or they go for life support to suffocate the crew. The Vora were doing neither. "Engineering," Vance whispered. "Captain," Thorne asked, floating up beside her. "They are heading for the main reactor," Vance said. Her eyes widened as the horrific realization set in. The EMP didn't destroy the core. It just tripped the emergency fail-safes. The uranium is still in there. The fusion cells are fully loaded. "Why would they want the reactor?" Ensign Miller asked. "If they breach it, they'll blow the whole ship. They'll kill themselves." "They don't care about dying, Ensign," Vance said softly. She looked out the viewport. Outside, the massive Leviathan hung in the void. Its colossal bow was glowing brighter, a terrifying sun of destructive energy, preparing to fire upon the planet New Washington. "Look at the dreadnought," Vance said. "It takes immense power to crack a planet's crust. They are charging their weapon, but it takes time. Time they know our fleet won't give them. They need a catalyst, a jumpstart." Thorne's face went pale. "They want to siphon our reactor core. If they link our fusion reserves to their dreadnought via a tether, they can bypass their own charging cycle. If they reach engineering," Vance said, her voice dropping to a dead flat tone, "they fire that weapon in 3 minutes instead of 10. 2 billion people die before the evacuation transports even break the atmosphere." The bridge was completely silent. The math was simple. The reality was absolute. They were not just fighting for their ship anymore. They were the only thing standing between an alien strike team and the trigger to a doomsday weapon. "Commander Thorne," Vance said. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. The gravity of her voice pulled every eye in the room to her. "Take the bridge crew. Proceed to the escape pods on Deck 2, jettison and make for the planetary surface." Thorne stared at her. And what are you going to do, Captain Entebbe? I am going to engineering. I am going to manually overload the reactor core and scuttle this ship before they can tap it. With respect, Captain, go to hell, Thorne said. He didn't blink. I've served on this boat for 6 years. I'm not abandoning her, and I'm sure as hell not abandoning you. We go together. Miller racked the bolt of his rifle. We're with you, ma'am. Vance looked at her crew. She saw fear, yes, but the fear was buried beneath a bedrock of duty. They were United States sailors. They had sworn an oath, not to a piece of cloth, not to a politician, but to the people sleeping on the planet below. Lock your visors, Vance ordered, pulling her own EVA helmet down and sealing it with a sharp hiss of pressurized air. We drop down the secondary maintenance shafts. We beat them to engineering. We hold the door. They moved like ghosts through the dead ship. Without gravity, they pulled themselves hand over hand down the narrow vertical maintenance tubes. The ship groaned around them. Every creak of the hull sounded like a dying breath. As they descended past Deck 5, they saw the aftermath of the Vora's advance. Through grating in the walls, they saw the corridors. Bodies floated in the darkness, human and alien. Blood drifted in slow, lazy spirals. Sparks from severed power lines flared like miniature fireworks in the vacuum. The Vora were slaughtering anyone in their path, but they were not stopping to confirm kills. They were a battering ram aimed straight at the heart of the vengeance. Vance reached the bottom of the shaft. She kicked open the grate and floated out into the grand foyer outside the main engineering bay. Chief Barnes was already there. He and 3 surviving mechanics had dragged heavy steel cargo crates across the entrance to the reactor room, forming a makeshift barricade. Captain, Barnes nodded. His uniform was scorched black, his left arm bound tightly with a bloody tourniquet. Doors locked behind us. Reactor is quiet, but they're coming. I can hear them through the deck plates. Good to see you, Chief, Vance said, floating behind the barricade and bracing her rifle on a steel crate. How much time to rig the core for an overload? Without the automated systems, I have to pull the control rods by hand, Barnes said. It'll take 10 minutes to reach critical mass. We don't have 10 minutes, Vance said. Before Barnes could reply, the ship violently shuddered. It wasn't an internal explosion, it was an impact from the outside. Through the thick armor-glass window overlooking the exterior hull, a sudden blinding flash of light erupted in the darkness. Vance turned her head. For a brief shining moment, her heart stopped. Space tore open, but this time it was not the sickly purple wound of the Vora. It was the sharp, clean blue flash of human slipspace engines. One by one, ships began to materialize. They were not capital ships. They were light frigates, corvettes, fast attack fighters. They bore the white star of the United States Space Force. It was the 7th Cavalry Squadron, a rapid response reserve unit stationed 2 sectors away. They had heard the distress call. They had burned their engines past the red line to get here. The cavalry, Ensign Miller whispered, a smile breaking across his pale face. Captain, they came. They actually came. Over the short-range tactical comms, a new voice broke through the static. USS Vengeance, this is Strike Commander Hayes, 7th Cav. We see you taking a beating out here. Hold your ground, sailors. We're bringing the rain. A cheer went up behind the barricade. The sailors, battered and bleeding, felt a sudden, intoxicating rush of hope. The cavalry was here. They weren't going to die alone in the dark. Outside the viewport, the human fighters swarmed like angry wasps. They dove toward the Leviathan, firing concentrated barrages of missiles and kinetic slugs. They wove through the enemy fire with reckless, beautiful precision. They were buying time. Vance watched them, but the knot in her stomach did not loosen. It tightened, because she knew what the Leviathan was capable of. Pull up 7th, Vance whispered to the glass. You don't have the armor. As if hearing her, the massive Vora dreadnought shifted its focus. It did not use its main gun. It did not need to. The surface of the Leviathan bristled with hundreds of automated point defense turrets. They all fired at once. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The void filled with an impenetrable web of green thermal energy. The human fighters, nimble and fast, simply had nowhere to fly. Vance watched as Strike Commander Hayes' frigate was caught in a crossfire. The ship's kinetic barriers held for 3 seconds. Then the hull flashed white. The frigate simply evaporated, breaking apart into a million pieces of burning slag. One by one, the blue engine trails were snuffed out. The 7th Cavalry did not retreat. They did not turn around. They kept flying forward, pouring fire into the belly of the beast until every last one of them was reduced to floating debris. The entire engagement lasted less than 40 seconds. 80 human ships, 2,000 men and women, gone, wiped from the galaxy like dust brushed off a table. Inside the Vengeance, the cheer died in the throats of the sailors. The silence that followed was heavier, colder, and more absolute than before. Hope had walked into the room and the enemy had slaughtered it right in front of their eyes. They came, Miller whispered, his voice cracking. He lowered his rifle, his eyes fixed on the burning wreckage outside. They came and they died. They bought us 40 seconds, Ensign, Vance said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying clarity. Do not disrespect their sacrifice by giving up. Miller blinked, pulling his gaze away from the window. He looked at his captain. He saw no despair. He saw only a cold, calculated fury. Barnes, Vance commanded. How long to rig a manual detonation using the remaining torpedo warheads in the lower magazine? Barnes wiped his mouth. If we carry them up here and wire them to the reactor casing, 5 minutes. It won't be a nuclear yield, but it'll blow the spine out of this ship. Nothing survives. Do it, Vance said. Suddenly, the heavy blast doors at the far end of the engineering foyer groaned. A massive glowing blade of plasma pierced through the center of the steel door. The metal began to melt, dripping like hot wax toward the deck. The Vora had arrived. They're here, Thorne said, raising his rifle and clicking the fire selector to full auto. Vance did not take her eyes off the melting door. She checked the chamber of her sidearm. 1 round in the pipe, 14 in the magazine. Chief Barnes, Vance said, her voice echoing inside her helmet. Get behind the reactor shielding. Wire those warheads. No matter what you hear out here, no matter what happens, you do not stop until that detonator is wired. Understood. Understood, Captain, Barnes said. He turned and pulled himself into the reactor room, the heavy vault door sealing behind him. Vance turned back to the barricade. She looked at Thorne, at Miller, and the 3 remaining mechanics. 6 humans, standing against an invading horde of monsters. The door glowed brighter. The plasma cutter reached the bottom of the frame. You know the odds, Vance said, her voice steady. They are going to breach that door. They are going to come through with everything they have. They want our ship. They want our home. The heavy steel door suddenly blew completely off its hinges, flying across the zero-gravity room and smashing into a bulkhead. Through the smoke, the massive armored silhouettes of the Vora strike team appeared. Their green visors glowed in the dark. Their weapons hummed with lethal energy. Let's show them, Vance said, raising her weapon and locking her boots to the deck, that humanity does not bleed quietly. Open fire. The corridor erupted in violence. The final stand of the USS Vengeance had begun. The engineering foyer of the USS Vengeance became an abattoir. In the weightless freezing dark, the air filled with the deafening roar of kinetic rifles and the shrieking hiss of alien plasma. The Vora did not use cover. They did not need to. They advanced like a wall of dark, jagged iron, absorbing the human gunfire with their personal shields until the energy barriers shattered, and then they just kept coming. Captain Alara Vance braced her boots against the deck, grating her assault rifle kicking violently against her shoulder. The muzzle flashes painted the room in strobes of harsh, blinding white. In those flashes, the nightmare was illuminated. Beside her, a young mechanic took a plasma bolt straight to the chest. There was no sound. The zero-gravity environment swallowed his final breath. The heat of the alien weapon instantly cauterized the wound, burning a hole clean through his armored vest. He drifted backward, off his magnetic boots, floating up toward the ceiling like a discarded marionette, his eyes weedy and fixed on the dark. Hold the line, Commander Elias Thorne roared, slamming a fresh magazine into his rifle. He didn't look at the floating boy. He couldn't. He leveled his weapon and fired a continuous, punishing burst into the faceplate of the nearest Vora warrior. The alien's visor cracked. Black blood sprayed into the vacuum, forming perfect floating spheres of gore. The massive creature slumped forward, but the one behind it simply stepped over the corpse, raising a heavy particle cannon. Ensign Miller was next to fall, the kid who had been running navigational sweeps just 20 minutes ago. The kid whose hands had trembled when Thorne gave him the rifle. He didn't run. He stood his ground. He emptied his weapon into the advancing tide, screaming a battle cry that no one could hear over the din of combat. A Vora blade humming with thermal energy swept through the dark. It cleaved clean through Miller's rifle and the armor beneath it. Miller collapsed, tethered to the floor only by his magnetic boots. Vance saw it happen. She felt a cold, jagged piece of her soul tear away. But she did not stop firing. She could not stop. She shifted her aim, putting 3 depleted uranium slugs into the joint of the alien's armor. The monster collapsed, twitching violently. "Captain!" Thorne yelled over the comms, his voice ragged, breathing heavy. "We can't hold them. There are too many." They were down to 3, Vance, Thorne, and 1 surviving mechanic. They were backed up against the heavy vault door of the reactor room. Inside that room, Chief Barnes was supposed to be rigging the final detonator. The warheads that would blow the ship, deny the enemy their prize, and end this slaughter. Vance slammed her fist against the intercom panel beside the vault door. "Barnes, we are out of time. Blow the core. Do it now." Static hissed in her earpiece. Then the heavy vault door shrieked. It didn't open automatically. The manual override wheel spun, and the door cracked open just enough for Chief Barnes to pull himself through. His face was a mask of soot and despair. His left arm hung uselessly at his side. "Barnes," Vance shouted, grabbing him by the shoulder blade. "Where is the detonator?" "Blow the ship." "I can't," Barnes choked out. His voice was hollow, broken. The words hit Vance harder than a physical blow. "What do you mean you can't? The warheads." "The warheads are wired," Barnes said, coughing violently into his helmet. "But the EMP, Captain, the EMP didn't just fuse the relays. It melted the firing pins on the manual triggers. I tried to jumpstart the spark with the emergency batteries. The circuits are slag, dead." The firing line went terrifyingly quiet as Thorne stopped shooting. His rifle clicked empty. He dropped the magazine. He reached for his belt. Empty. "The reactor won't blow," Barnes whispered, looking at the approaching Vora. "They're going to take the ship, Captain. They're going to use our core to crack the planet." Vance looked at the aliens. They were 20 feet away. They had stopped firing. They knew the humans were out of ammunition. They were raising their thermal blades, preparing to finish the job up close. 47 ships, 2 billion lives. And it was going to end here in the dark because of a melted wire. Vance closed her eyes. She took a breath. The air in her suit tasted of copper and sweat. When she opened her eyes, the despair was gone. Only a cold, absolute clarity remained. "Barnes," Vance said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "Take the mechanic. Go down the auxiliary shaft to the portside escape pods. Eject, now." "Captain," Barnes stared at her. "That is a direct order, Chief. Get off my ship." "What about you?" Thorne asked. He didn't have a gun anymore. He had pulled a heavy steel wrench from his belt. He was preparing to die swinging. "I am going back up to the bridge," Vance said. "The bridge is dead, Alara," Thorne said, using her first name for the first time in 6 years. "The helm is offline." "The main helm is offline," Vance corrected. "The auxiliary thrusters run on a closed-loop chemical battery. They aren't wired to the reactor. They weren't touched by the EMP. There is enough juice in those batteries to move this ship one last time." Thorne looked at her. He understood. He saw the terrible, beautiful math in her eyes. She wasn't going to blow the ship from the inside. She was going to use the entire USS Vengeance as a bullet. "I'm coming with you," Thorne said. "No, Elias, you aren't." Vance reached out and grabbed his shoulder. Her grip was iron. "Someone has to hold this shaft while I make the climb. Someone has to buy me 3 minutes." Thorne looked at the Vora. He looked at the heavy wrench in his hand. Then he looked back at Yen, his captain. He didn't salute. There was no room for ceremony in the dark. He just nodded. 3 minutes, Captain," Thorne said. His voice was steady, proud. "Give them hell." Vance unclipped her battered, blood-stained United States Space Force insignia from her chest plate. She pressed it into Chief Barnes's hand. "Give this to Admiral Graves," Vance ordered softly. "Tell him we held the line. Tell him it was a good trip." Barnes gripped the metal badge. He didn't argue. He grabbed the surviving mechanic by the harness and dragged him toward the escape hatch. Vance turned to the vertical maintenance shaft. She didn't look back at Thorne. If she looked back, she might hesitate. She grabbed the rungs and began to pull herself up into the blackness. Below her in the engineering foyer, Commander Elias Thorne let out a guttural roar, pushed off the bulkhead, and launched himself directly into the path of the alien boarding party. The sound of his final stand echoed up the metal shaft, the dull thud of steel against armor, the hiss of plasma, a defiant, very human shout, and then silence. Vance climbed. Her muscles screamed. Her lungs burned. The ship was dying around her. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Without life support, the cold of deep space was bleeding through the hull, frosting the metal rungs beneath her gloves. She reached deck 2. The corridor was empty. The Vora had all moved down toward the reactor. She hauled herself out of the shaft and floated down the main hallway toward the bridge. The heavy blast doors were blown open. The command deck was exactly as she had left it, a graveyard of shattered glass, sparking consoles and floating debris. The red emergency lights cast long, skeletal shadows across the room. Vance pulled herself into the captain's chair. She reached under the armrest and pulled a heavy red manual lever. Deep beneath the floorboards, chemical batteries snapped alive. The auxiliary console in front of her flickered, then glowed with a faint amber light. It was analog, old tech, the kind of system built for absolute worst-case scenarios. Thrusters online, Vance whispered to the empty room. Outside the viewport, the Leviathan hung like a black mountain against the stars. The massive dreadnought had reached the firing coordinates. The cavernous opening at its bow was no longer just glowing. It was a swirling vortex of nuclear fire. The energy was bleeding off into space, distorting the starlight around it. The targeting lasers were solid, locked directly onto the continental shelf of New Washington. 1 minute to firing. Vance reached for the comms panel. The main transmitter was dead, but the emergency shortwave radio had a faint pulse. She plugged it directly into her helmet feed. The static cleared. The voice of Admiral Thaddeus Graves filled her ears. He was broadcasting on an open fleet-wide channel. He was speaking to the shattered remnants of the Second Fleet, to the lifeboats floating in the void, to the men and women bleeding out in the dark. "I know we are bleeding," Graves's voice echoed, heavy, tired, unbroken. "I know some of you will not be coming home." Vance locked her boots into the floor clamps beneath the helm. She wrapped her hands around the manual analog steering yokes. They were cold and heavy. "I am not going to lie to you," the Admiral continued. "The odds are gone. The line is breaking." Through the viewport, Vance saw a Vora destroyer moving to intercept the battered flagship of the Second Fleet. The human ships were dying. They were out of ammunition. They were out of time, out of ammunition. They were out of time. But look down, Graves commanded. "Look at the planet beneath you. 2 billion souls, sleeping in their beds. They don't know the dark is here. They don't know the monsters are real, because we stand in the way." Vance reached forward and flipped the safety covers off the auxiliary throttle controls. Behind her, the doors to the bridge hissed. Vance didn't turn around. She watched the reflection in the dark armor-glass window. 3 Vora warriors drifted onto the command deck. Their thermal blades glowed, casting a sickly green light over the dead consoles. They had realized the reactor was a trap. They had come for the helm. They raised their weapons. "They deserve a chance to wake up tomorrow." Graves's voice thundered through the static. "That is why we fight. That is why we Not for glory, not for medals." Vance drew her sidearm from her hip. She didn't look back. She simply raised the weapon over her shoulder, judging the angle from the reflection in the glass. She fired 3 times. The heavy slugs tore through the zero-gravity vacuum. The lead Vora warrior caught a round straight through its visor. It collapsed backward, crashing into the others. Vance dropped the emptied pistol. It clattered against the deck. She wrapped both hands tightly around the throttle. "Protecting the weak," Graves said, his voice dropping to a fierce, ragged whisper. "Standing between the innocent and the fire, that is what makes us human. That is our identity." Vance looked at the Leviathan. The vortex of energy at its bow reached critical mass. A brilliant, blinding beam of pure destruction began to form. "And I promise you," Graves said, "we will hold this line." "Yes, we will, Admiral," Vance whispered into the empty room. She shoved the throttles all the way forward. She pushed them until the metal housing cracked. The USS Vengeance roared. The chemical thrusters ignited with a violence that shook the entire frame of the destroyer. Without the safety dampeners of the main reactor, the G-force was instantaneous and crushing. Vance was slammed back into her chair. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. Blood vessels popped in her eyes. The structural integrity alarms began to scream a high-pitched wail of tearing metal and failing armor. The ship was not flying. It was falling. Falling upward, driven by pure, unfiltered thrust directly toward the maw of the enemy dreadnought. The Vora gunboats saw her moving. They swarmed, firing desperate volleys of plasma. The green bolts impacted the hull of the Vengeance, tearing away armor plating, melting the communications array, stripping the ship down to its skeleton. Vance didn't flinch. She kept her hands locked on the yoke. She steered the burning, dying destroyer through the gauntlet of fire. The Leviathan loomed larger and larger. It filled the viewport. It filled the world. The firing chamber at its bow was a sea of nuclear fire. 10 seconds to impact. The heat inside the bridge spiked. The armor-glass window began to spiderweb, cracking under the intense thermal radiation. Vance didn't close her eyes. She stared into the fire. She thought of the miners, the farmers, the children on the world below. She thought of Thorne holding a wrench in the dark. She thought of Miller standing his ground. 5 seconds. The Vengeance breached the dreadnought's microgravity field. 3 seconds. The armor glass shattered. The vacuum tore at her suit. 1 second. Captain Alara Vance did not scream. She did not pray. She held the line. The USS Vengeance struck the Leviathan. It did not hit the armor. It drove precisely perfectly into the center of the charging superweapon at the dreadnought's bow. 70,000 tons of human titanium and depleted uranium traveling at maximal velocity collided with the concentrated, unstable energy of a planet-cracking laser. The resulting explosion defied the physics of sound. There was no boom. There was only a sudden, absolute absence of reality. A sphere of pure, blinding white light expanded in the void. It moved with terrifying speed, vaporizing the front half of the 20-mile-long Leviathan instantly. The dreadnought's own weapon turned inward. The chain reaction traveled down the spine of the alien ship, igniting its dark matter cores one by one. The Leviathan did not just break apart, it was erased. The shockwave radiated outward, a ripple of blue and gold energy that caught the Vora vanguard. The alien destroyers and gunboats closest to the blast were caught in the tidal wave of destruction, their hulls cracking like eggshells before they too were consumed by the fire. From the surface of New Washington, 2 billion people looked up at the night sky. They saw a new star ignite. It burned brighter than the moon. It cast long, sharp shadows across the sleeping cities. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. Then the star slowly faded, returning the sky to the quiet dark. They did not know what they had just witnessed. They did not know the price that had been paid for their tomorrow. They just went back to sleep. In high orbit, the silence returned. The debris field was massive. Twisted metal, drifting ice, the graveyard of a fleet. The remaining Vora ships, stripped of their flagship, stripped of their momentum, did what they had never done before in recorded history. They turned. They ignited their space drives, and they fled. They retreated into the dark, leaving the system to the humans. On the bridge of the fleet flagship, Admiral Thaddeus Graves stood before the massive tactical display. The red icons of the enemy were vanishing, jumping out of the sector. The green icons of his own fleet were few. Too few. The bridge was dead silent. The officers stared at their monitors, exhausted, bleeding, hollowed out by the sheer scale of the violence. "Damage report," Graves asked. His voice was barely a whisper. His executive officer stepped forward, holding a data pad. His hand shook. "The enemy has retreated from the sector, Admiral. New Washington is secure. Planetary shields are intact. Civilian casualties are 0. Graves closed his eyes. He let out a long, slow breath. "And the fleet?" "We held the line, sir," the officer said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the cost?" "Tell me the cost, Commander." 80% of the defensive line is gone, sir. The 7th Cavalry is wiped out. 4 destroyers lost. 11 frigates. 2 cruisers." The officer swallowed hard. 1,420 personnel confirmed dead or missing. 1,420, not a statistic, not a number. Fathers, daughters, mechanics, pilots. Graves opened his eyes. He looked out to the viewport at the drifting wreckage of the USS Vengeance. There was almost nothing left of the ship, just jagged pieces of hull plating slowly spinning in the cold light of the distant sun. The door to the bridge hissed open. A medic walked in guiding a man in a scorched, blood-soaked uniform. It was Chief Petty Officer Barnes. His arm was in a sling. He looked like a ghost who had walked out of hell. Barnes didn't salute. He didn't have the strength. He walked slowly across the command deck. The other officers parted to let him through. He stopped in front of Admiral Graves. With his good hand, Barnes reached into his pocket. He pulled out a piece of twisted, blackened metal, the United States Space Force insignia. He held it out. "From Captain Vance, sir," Barnes said, his voice cracking. He looked Graves directly in the eye. "She said to tell you we held the line, and she said it was a good trip." Admiral Graves reached out. His large, calloused hand trembled slightly as he took the badge. He felt the weight of it. It weighed nothing. It weighed everything. He closed his fist around the metal. "It was," Graves whispered. He turned back to the viewport. The local star was beginning to rise over the curvature of New Washington, casting a brilliant golden light across the darkness. It illuminated the debris. It illuminated the blood. The galaxy is a cold, indifferent place. It does not care about borders. It does not care about right or wrong. The dark's full of monsters waiting for the fires to burn out so they can feast on the weak. The Vora had learned a lesson today, a lesson written in fire and titanium. They had learned that when you back a human into a corner, they do not surrender. When you threaten their homes, they do not negotiate. Admiral Graves looked down at the blue and green jewel of the colony world. 2 billion people waking up to a new day, safe, ignorant of the blood spilled above their heads. He squeezed the badge in his hand until the sharp edges bit into his palm. This was the burden of the uniform. This was the silent oath taken by every man and woman who strapped themselves into a cockpit and flew into the void. There will be other wars. There will be other monsters. The dark is vast and the line is thin. But out here on the edge of the frontier, a promise had been made. A promise paid for by Captain Allura Vance, by Elias Thorne, by Ensign Miller, by 1,420 sailors who refused to take a step backward. It is a promise that echoes across the stars waiting for the next time the shadows move. When you call for help, the United States Space Force will not ask how many enemies there are. They will not calculate the odds. They will come, always.